In this exercise, we're going to work on the French seam. A French seam is basically an enclosed seam, but the final amount of the seam allowance is 1/2 inch. So your notch here would indicate from the raw cut edge a total of 1/2 inch. We can't sew beyond that, or we would make the garment smaller. So to do this, we're going to actually need to cut 2 of this pattern piece. So I can lay my fabric out. I'm going to do this 1 layer. I don't have selvage here, so I'm going to do my stretch test, my pull test. If I have give, that must be the cross grain, and if I pull and I don't feel any give, that must be the straight grain. So I'm going to align my pattern, looking at my grain line, align it along the straight grain, and notice that I'm just backing off a little bit because I'm looking at this cut seam. I'm not so sure that was a straight grain, and I'm going to actually go away a bit from my raw edge here. That way I know that all my my yarns will be in alignment. So I'm going to go ahead and weight this down, and then I'm going to trace around this pattern piece. Don't forget the notch marks. You can remove the weights. Now, because on a seam has a left and a right, or a front and a back, we have to pair that. So I'm going to flip the pattern over so it's a mirror image of what I just traced, and I'm going to use the exact same line here that I drew at this edge, and I'm going to draw the second, trace around the second piece that I need. And of course you could put your weights on here. I chose not to. And then don't forget to mark where your notches are. That's going to be very important when we sew. So now that I'm done drawing the 2 pieces that I need, I can go ahead and cut this out. Okay, now I'm going to separate the 2 pieces along that original line that I used to butt up the pattern piece to. Be very precise with this cut. So you want to be very precise when you separate the 2, because this should still measure a 1/2 inch from the edge of either of those, for either of those. Now we're going to decide which is the face side. So I'm going to use my marking pen. Draw some marks so I know that's my face side. And then we need some pins. To begin the French seam, we're actually going to sew wrong sides together first. So we're actually going to see on both sides the face side, and we're placing the wrong side of the fabric together, and then match your cut edges up very close, exactly in position. I'm going to pin this together in place. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually sew from the edge here, not the 1/2 inch, but we're actually going to sew half of that. So we're going to make a seam right down here, 1/4 inch from our cut edge. Then we'll trim it a little bit, then we'll fold, we'll press it, and then we'll fold the pieces together, face side together, and we'll sew another 1/4 inch seam, which should match our original notch. So we're ready to go to the machine. Okay, so I'm ready to work on the French seam. And this seam is a little bit different than what we've been doing previously. Previously, we've been matching face sides together. But for the French seam, we're actually going to start a first line of sewing with wrong sides together. So we'll be seeing the face side. But don't worry, we're going to be enclosing our seam. So also notice that I have a notch here. That's my 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's the total width that the allowance can be. So, and we want everything enclosed. So if I sew beyond that, I'm actually making the garment smaller. But I want to enclose this raw edge that's running here with the fabric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam, and then I will trim it, turn it, and then sew it again. And we'll see all those processes together. So I've got everything pinned here. That kind of helps me in the beginning keep everything together. So I'm going to take this first one out. And then I'm going to make sure that my fabrics are aligned. Again, wrong sides together. And I'm going to lift my presser foot and push that fabric up, lining it with the 1/4 inch seam just past the needle. And I'm going to start off with a back stitch. And I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam all the way down. Get ready to backstitch at the end. Backstitch, bring that needle all the way back up. Go ahead and trim your threads. Okay, so now I have this 1/4 inch seam, and yes, we are looking at the face side of the fabric, but we're going to end up turning this and enclosing this, so we are actually putting face sides together for the next sewing. But we need to do a couple things before we actually get there. So we're going to trim this seam about 1/8 of an inch, press it, trim it, and then we'll turn it and we'll sew it again. So let's go over to the pressing mat to do that. Okay, so for the next step of the French seam, I'm just going to press this seam really quick. And then with my scissors, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to trim. We'll call this a skinny 1/8 of an inch. Okay, and what that's going to do, that's just going to give us a little bit more room, because this was 1/4 inch originally. We're going to actually encase that seam now. Remember, this is the face side. So the way I like to do this is, if with it flat, I'll take one of the layers and I'm going to fold that directly over that seam allowance and make sure that seam is nice and flush. And I'll just give it a quick press. Right? So again, this is the face side, this is the wrong side. So now I have the seam allowance pressed toward one side of the face side because I folded this fabric over it and pressed it. Now what I'm going to do is I can, because I've got a nice crease there on that seam, I can hold this and I can flip it so the other side turns flush with that seam. And now on this side, I can press that nice and flat. Now again, we're looking at the wrong side now. And what we're going to do, you see, remember our notches? This is the full width of our 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're going to stitch from notch to notch, and that really will be another 1/4 inch seam. So we're ready to go back to the machine again, and we'll stitch from this notch to this notch. Okay, so we're ready to finish up this French seam. And we've folded, we've encased this. This is the original seam allowance. We folded over the face sides together, got everything nicely pressed for this final stitching. And notice that we have a notch up here. This is our final seam width, allowance width. notch as well as here on the bottom. So we want to stitch actually between those two notches. And whatever this notch is, you'll have to ignore what's going on here on your machine. So for instance, if I put this up here, that's where the notch is. Looks like it's coming over a little bit. Maybe I sewed a little bit less than 1/4 inch for the first seam, but be sure that you actually are sewing on this seam allowance because that's the actual fit of the garment. So I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to eye it. I didn't draw a line between the two notches. You could do that if that will help you in the beginning, but I'm going to just line everything up, and we'll see how I did in assessment. So I've started this by putting this fabric up under here, under the presser foot, pressing down right at that notch, getting that needle right at that notch, and I'm going to start off with a back stitch. And then I'm going to go ahead and sew. And what I'm doing here is, you can't see it, this is the final notch if I line it up here at the edge. So what I'm doing here with this notch is I'm kind of eyeing it while I'm sewing so that I can actually align that notch straight up with the needle. And so that's how I'm sewing this straight line. And as I'm getting here now, you can see where this notch is. So I'm aligning this notch straight up with the needle. And I'm going to sew that notch. I'm coming up to the end, so I'm going to get ready to back stitch. Back stitch. Bring that needle up. And I can take this clip. Alright, and so there's the finished seam that I just sewed. And if you look, we pull open just a quick look before we go to press. Now I've got the face side, and I've got a really nice seam here, and I've got all of everything else enclosed in this French seam. Let's go to the pressing mat.